Hello, and welcome to today's event on higher education data. Americans have been conditioned to think of student loans as an investment. They take on the debt because they believe college is the ticket to forward mobility, so it'll pay off in the end. But the cost value equation has changed. Adjusted for inflation, the cost of higher education for public and private four-year colleges have nearly tripled in the past 40 years. Meanwhile, college graduates in many fields won't earn enough to pay back their loans anytime soon. That doesn't mean you shouldn't go to college or pursue your preferred field of study. It means that you should do it with eyes wide open. How much will this school cost? How much debt will you need to take on? And what can you expect to earn afterwards? The federal government has troves of data that can help families answer those questions. So, the questions we want to explore today are: how would it help? What are the challenges in making it happen? And how can we overcome them? My name is Morgan Stevens, and I'm a research assistant at the Center for Data Innovation, a think tank studying the intersection of data, technology, and public policy. I am joined today by a wonderful group of panelists: Jennifer Engel, the Director of Data for the US program at the Gates Foundation; Charles Ansell, the Vice President for Research, Policy, and Advocacy at Complete College America; and Rachel Rotunda, the Director of Government Relations at the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. For everyone joining us today, this program is meant to be interactive, and your questions and comments are most welcome. If you're watching online, you're invited to submit questions via Slido. If you're watching on the Center's website, you can see the link for Slido at the bottom of the page. And if you follow issues like this, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and turn on notifications to hear about more events and to see all of our past events. So to get started, I'd like to start with Charles, if that's all right with you. What data is available to students and their families today, and how do they use it to inform post-secondary plans?
Thank you. I think when it comes to data that's available, and I'll be curious to hear what my co-panelists think, I think mostly of the White House College Scorecard data and its subsidiaries, right? So the White House, I believe in the Obama years, put out a plethora of data that really provides not just information on how much different colleges cost, but also added down the road how much different majors cost and what the expected return on them would be. I would also say that outside of that, there are data sets that use data from White House College Scorecard, as well as from iPads and from the U.S. Department of Education and others, to provide input into economic mobility indices, right? So, what's the chance of, say, a student from a lower household income quintile to go up, one or two quintiles, or to go from, as the Rod Shetty data put it, to go from being coming from a relatively poor household to becoming a rich adult. I think that, beyond those two things, I think it essentially provides, I would say, I guess, four different components. There's likely returns from education and wage data. There's the college cost information, financial aid information, and institutional profile information. And this might be getting too far ahead, so I won't go too far. But I think that the problem comes when some of those sources are hard to get at, when they're non-standardized, when they're not comprehensive, and when institutions themselves aren't sharing information honestly. And I think that Cognos has a huge role to play to address those gaps.
Absolutely. And Jennifer, would you have any more thoughts about the limitations of the currently available data?
Definitely. I agree with Charles that the college scorecard was a really important step forward, in particular getting earnings data, because, many students, especially students from low-income backgrounds, do see college as a path toward upward economic mobility. Unfortunately, because we've seen the cost of college increase so considerably, and we've seen completion rates improve modestly, but not enough, the cost of college and the cost of failing to complete college is really become a serious burden for students. And we're putting a lot of that burden on the students themselves because of public disinvestment in higher education at the state and the federal level. So I think this conversation is just even more important than ever because the cost of failure for students is so very high. Again, those earnings data were a critical step forward. Graduation rates, earnings data, debt data, those are really critical pieces of information for students to have. The challenge is that, our data systems were not built with today's students in mind, and they weren't built to really address the problems that today's students are facing. So, existing data sets cover some of the students, some of the time, some of the programs, et cetera. And what happens is those gaps in information become gaps for students as they're seeking to navigate from high school into post-secondary, or for adults who might be looking to upskill with college. One of the biggest gaps is lack of disaggregation of data. Again, some of the data is disaggregated by race, some of it's disaggregated by income, but really some really critical pieces of information aren't disaggregated by either, or they're only disaggregated by one or the other. Debt data in particular is not disaggregated by race, ethnicity, and we know that students of color in particular are more likely to borrow, Black students especially, and we know that they're not necessarily being supported through to completion, and therefore they're at higher risk of default. So having personalized information about students like them is really critical for all students. And unless we have disaggregated data by multiple characteristics, students won't have the information they need to make that good choice.
Morgan, can I just tack on one factoid onto that, just to because I completely agree, and I just want to add a fine point to one thing, which is just, Jennifer, you brought up how, failure to attain the credential is really key here. And that's certainly how Complete College America has gotten into this work. And I think the statistic is that more than half of Black borrowers who do not complete a credential default. So, I mean, the student loan crisis is a college completion crisis as well.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And just going off of that, are there different types of data that might affect different, predictions about college outcomes? Like, are there different types of data that might help students complete college versus then find employment afterwards, or stay at one college versus another?
Well, I mean, I'll start, but I mean, this is something, I know, Jennifer, you also obviously know a ton about is, right now, there's some data, and obviously it's put into iPads, and obviously, as has been mentioned, I mean, iPads is very outmoded relative to what higher education needs. And, they're trying their best, but I mean, it's ultimately aggregating information through a laborious process. And what would be ideal is to be able to submit files the way that many of our audience members, I'm sure, do today through the National Student Clearinghouse. And so in the absence of that, there's been a market-driven solution to bring up the data that predicts college completion through the post-secondary data partnership. And that gets at these indicators, right? Like I know in Georgia, as an example, if a student passes intro math and English in their first year, they're 10 times more likely to wrap up their degree. Those types of predictors are what the post-secondary data partnership captures. I think ideally we would have it at a federal level, but the market-driven solution is a place so far. Jennifer, is that fair?
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, Complete College America was really out in front with the completion movement when that really started around 2008, 2009, and put data at the center of, really improving college completion, because you can't mind what you can't measure. At the time, we didn't have Pell graduation rates. We didn't have any information about completion for part-time or transfer students. And Complete College America put that information front and center as part of its initiative, including some of those early momentum metrics that Charles just mentioned around credit accumulation in the first year, getting critical courses taken in the first year, selecting a major in the first year, highly predictive of your future outcomes. We've been supporters of the post-secondary data partnership at the National Student Clearinghouse and have brought together initiatives like Complete College America, Achieving the Dream, and others who had been collecting data on their own to support their college completion initiatives, so that we could start to build a data set that could help us answer questions and do some benchmarking for these institutions and these organizations that are really working on college completion. So agree, though, that a more comprehensive solution is needed, but the voluntary work in the interim shows that institutions and states want this information. They use this information when they have it, and they can use it to positive effect for students.
Absolutely. And Rachel, I want to get your thoughts. Moving from completion, I guess, to the financial aid aspect of all of it. Are there what data is available to the students as they pursue the financial aid process and kind of go through that federal aid application process? Because I remember doing FAFSA, it was a whole lot, and I don't fully remember what was available with that, but it'd be interesting to get your thoughts about what's available to students through that.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. I would first echo everything that Jennifer and Charles have already shared related to the scorecard. And I think your question kind of ties into what initially came to mind for me at the onset of this conversation around the limitations of current data in the scorecard. Something that I know we talk about a lot in the financial aid community certainly is that we don't have data on all students. Much of what's in the scorecard comes from graduates who receive federal financial aid. Not all students submit a FAFSA, and that includes many students who are from low and moderate income families. I think a lot of folks initially think, oh, well, the only students who aren't filling out a FAFSA are from wealthier families, but there are many cases where students who are low income, have financial need, would likely qualify for federal student aid, may not fill out a FAFSA because of the barriers and how burdensome of a process that can be, which is something we're trying to fix in other ways. But there are also students who might not fill out a FAFSA because they don't think they're going to be eligible for aid when they in fact would be. Also, lots of students attending schools in the community college sector, lower cost institutions, may not choose to fill out a FAFSA. So we really don't have data on those students, which, depending on the institution and the particular program, can make up a really significant portion of students. And so that just, I think, kind of adds to what Jennifer and Charles have already described of this sort of incomplete picture that we currently have. I think we would all agree, and I think most folks in the higher ed community would agree, that the goal is to provide students with the ability to get a complete picture of their outcomes, not just in one moment in time, a year after graduation, but down the line. What are their outcomes related to earnings and increases in earnings, average amounts of debt and their ability to repay, and especially students who are like them, students who are also Pell recipients, who are also first generation college students. I think that that is sort of the goal, is all of these different metrics across different points in time, and being able to disaggregate data to really look at certain student populations. And I think we'll probably get into this a little bit later, the implications that this data would have also for policymaking and for institutional practices, but certainly for students, first and foremost, just providing the full, complete picture. I think that relates to the question you just asked, Morgan, around students being able to go to the college scorecard or go to a federal data system and see what costs are, what average loan indebtedness is for students who are like them at the specific institution, and even down to the program level. I know that there were some enhancements to the college scorecard over the last few years that a lot of folks in the higher ed community were really excited about, adding program level data. But even with the addition of that data, of that program level information, not all programs are included. I think there was an estimate that just about 20% of academic programs nationwide, there actually is data in the scorecard because of some, privacy considerations and just like the number of students in those programs. So that's, I think, another area that we haven't talked about quite as much as, it's great to have program level data added to the scorecard, but I think we still have a long way to go in terms of providing really like universal access for students across the country at different institutions, different programs, to all be able to have access to that data on completion, on earnings, and just overall outcomes.
Absolutely. And in giving that, I guess, more complete picture, just kind of drilling down, what types of data should students and parents and guidance counselors have better access to? And are there any that would most impact student debt?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this spans, not just this conversation about, we've been talking a lot about the scorecard and about sort of a universal federal data system that students and parents would have access to, but I think this also goes a little bit into the kind of consumer information lane. So, we talked about the scorecard, things like program costs, average indebtedness by institution, by program level. But there's also, something we do a lot of work on at NASA and with our members is around the information that institutions are providing directly to students. So we want students to be able to kind of compare institution to institution via federal data, but also want to make sure that when a student is talking directly to an institution they're either already enrolled at or are considering enrolling in, the information that that institution is providing to them related to college costs, related to the aid that they're eligible for. We've been engaging in a lot of work around aid offers. That doesn't, get so much into, things like average indebtedness, but it does get into what are your costs going to be? What is an accurate prediction or estimate of those costs? What types of aid are you eligible for? What is the difference in those two things? And how do you fill the gap between grants and scholarships, between what your estimated costs are? And that ultimately contributes to what your year by year, as well as cumulative loan balance and overall debt balance is going to be.
Can I add something really quick to what Rachel just said there? I think that's so important. And it makes me think of this as almost like two different lanes, which is, one is how comprehensive, well, at least two different lanes, there's probably more, but, how comprehensive is the data that is being collected, but then also, how do we know that the data that we're getting is accurate and integral and that folks are submitting appropriately? Back in, I want to say December, but very recently, there was this Government Accountability Office report that showed that 91% of colleges understate or don't even include net price in their offers, right? And that's kind of like the metric that Rachel was getting at, right? And so if nobody's even getting that information, and we're talking about that being very important, this of course leads to many students enrolling in colleges that are harder to afford than the information that they received would imply. It's another way in which the student debt crisis is a college completion crisis, because students who can't afford college, when they were led to think that they could, they either A, take out more loans, or B, are less likely to complete. And, I think that, one of the things that we'll probably be getting to is, what's Congress's role there? What's the department's role there? And what's the present appetite in the House for moving on that shocking information that came out last year?
Yeah, I'd also.
Sorry, go ahead.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
I would just also add, completion rates, fully disaggregatable, really critical by multiple student characteristics. Time to degree is something we haven't talked about here. This is not a piece of information that's currently available through iPads or through the college scorecard. It could be constructed with the data set that is supporting the college scorecard. Time to completion, there's a pretty wide range at different institutions. We tend to look at 4-year or 6-year completion rates, but every semester additional that a student has to take to complete because, say, their courses weren't available, there wasn't sufficient advising to help them, select courses in a way that would make sure they didn't have to take extra courses or extra time. That all adds to that cumulative net price in terms of, what students are incurring. We supported an initiative called the Post-Secondary Value Commission, came out with a report in 2021. And, one of the really critical findings there was that, one, the impact of time to credential on that overall cost, but two, the students who were leaving without a credential were oftentimes already paying up to, tens of thousands of dollars, and then leaving without that credential and without that degree to be able to pay it back. So that, again, just, putting what Charles's comment about the debt crisis being a completion crisis into even further relief, we see that is a serious issue for students.
Absolutely. Rachel, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think when Charles, with what Charles shared earlier, um, something that came to mind for me is, there's this conversation around transparency and the information and kind of consumer disclosures that institutions are providing to students. And that's extremely important. And we need to be working on that now. But I think it also speaks, that issue speaks to kind of this larger issue of the data insufficiency. I mean, data doesn't lie. And so if we can really build an infrastructure of data that provides students with user-friendly access to this information, I think it will only help some of the other transparency challenges that we've seen, really, especially popping up in recent years.
Absolutely. So kind of going off of the transparency thing and making sure that we have accurate data to give students, how might more access to hopefully accurate data push higher education officials to kind of reform and improve their institutions and make sure that students are in fact completing college and receiving or their programs and receiving a credential?
Well, I would say that, equally as important as providing information to students to help them navigate where to go to college is making sure that institutions have actionable and timely information to improve student outcomes. Many low income students, first generation students, students of color are place bound. They're going to go to the local community college or four-year institution. They may not actually have a choice to make because of cost or other types of considerations. So we need to make sure that the institutions that are serving these student populations have the information they need to improve, because it's imperative that they improve if we're going to improve outcomes for these student populations. So really thinking about not just data as compliance, which I think is where we currently are in terms of institutions have to submit data to IPEDS as part of their Title IV eligibility. That's a compliance exercise. It's not data for continuous improvement. Again, then that leads to more post-mortem metrics, like what happened after 6 years or 8 years, as opposed to those momentum metrics that Charles talked about earlier, which is what's happening to my students this semester, in their first semester, in their second semester. How can I, leverage that data to find the students who haven't enrolled for next term so that they can keep moving on that path towards credit accumulation. So really creating some actionable tools with the data so that the data providers actually see more value from the information that they're submitting by creating actionable tools for institutional leaders.
Absolutely. And Charles, um, excuse me, would any of this would having access to better data help with the completion goals for college and university officials to then improve their completion goals?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I take that question as kind of like, if you know more about student reality, you'll be able to improve it even more. And I think that what we end up seeing in the policy realm, or at least in terms of the policies that are super effective, is that data either galvanizing policy that allows for the best practice to take hold, because you're using that data, as Jennifer put it, not so much for compliance, but like for decision support. At the same time, you want to be able to also have it influence how you're funding colleges, right? So if I were to give an example in each category, states that have really strong data, and there are a lot of really strong state data systems out there, do track the types of predictors that we've been talking about here. And, the more that you get data, for example, around what the pass rates are for students who are deemed by an institution to be academically not ready for English or math, and I put that in quotes because they usually are ready, then, you can see that the graduation rates are super low down the road. So then the policy that can come up is, leaving behind prerequisite driven remediation like California just did, like Louisiana just did. I would say on the other side too is all the different commissions from Texas to Illinois to elsewhere that look at how funding formulas bake in student success metrics. But then also, and this is an area where CCA is evolving ourselves, is how do you make sure that that funding is adequate and equitable, and that you're not just revisiting an operating budget, an operating allocation or appropriations every year based on the performance on these types of metrics that sometimes take years to see fruit from, or are already built on an inequitable foundation of appropriations from time immemorial. So to bottom line, what I'm saying, on the one hand, the practices, and then on the other, tying the predictors of college completion, which allow for the practices to flourish, to appropriations, but in a way that's far more equitable and just than exist at present today anywhere, frankly.
Absolutely. So you kind of touched a bit on what states are doing, but how could policymakers themselves at the state and federal level use more access to this data to inform higher education policies, or even K through 12 policies, to prepare students for that next level?
Well, I'll start, but I don't mean to monopolize. I mean, I think, just to be clear, like if there's more and more data, then there's more and more information on what sort of interventions policy could support. So, I think, to Jennifer's example of time to degree, it's very important that colleges are able to wrap up students in a responsible manner, that they're able to get out of a 4-year in 120 credits, that they're able to get out of a 2-year in 60 credits. And I know that, sometimes there's what I would say is an immoral pushback of, well, that doesn't help from a revenue generation perspective. But of course, that's also self-defeating. So if you do things like divorce learning from time by doing dual enrollment in high school and in college at the same time, or getting rid of prereq-driven remediation, or allowing credit for competency from the workplace, study after study has shown that the attempted credits that you generate on the back end makes it a revenue net positive. But that's also like such immature information. There's hardly been enough talk about composite metrics between student success and finance to even start having those conversations. And that's because we just don't have the comprehensive data that, could be pushed at a federal level, and failing that through the market or at a state or municipal level.
Absolutely. And kind of going off that point, we have our first audience question. Isn't it in the college's interest to have students take 6 years to complete? They make more money per degree. Thoughts? Rachel, is it in fact in the college's interest to do so?
From where I sit, from financial aid administrators, the aid community, our goal is to help students succeed, help students earn degrees, and to Jennifer's point, get through their degree and complete and as quickly as possible, so that they can go on to pursue the careers they want, to see the increase in earnings that we know comes with a post-secondary credential. So I think you'd be hard pressed to find an institution that across the country would say we want our students to take longer than is necessary. Institutions, particularly those with that are mission-based institutions, public institutions, are there to help students achieve their education and career goals. So I'm not sure that I would necessarily agree with that idea. Happy to hear what other panelists think, but from the aid community perspective, it's a goal to help students get through as quickly as possible, so they can ultimately go on to do whatever their career dreams might be, because that's the reason they enrolled in the first place.
Yeah, I think that most colleges, I think, are not trying to keep students enrolled for as long as possible. However, many colleges aren't doing enough to make sure that students are enrolled for as little time as possible either. So, it's I think it's really critical for institutions to take a look at what are the institutional barriers to college completion. And there may be some revenue impacts of that, but to Charles's point, actually getting students through to completion, every year that a student takes longer is lessening their chances of actually completing that degree. The student completing that degree not only provides, potential funding to the institution, especially if they're in a performance-based funding state, as Charles was mentioning, but it also produces additional tax revenue for our country. So the investment in getting students through to completion, there's a huge payoff, not just for the individual student, but also for the broader economy for us to actually ensure that students are completing. So I think it is critical, though, to look at what those institutional barriers are. Institutions that have done a good job of this have looked at every aspect of their process. They've, had adults try to go through the same processes that they ask students to go through, and they find all of these inefficiencies and all of this runaround. And it's no wonder students give up and don't have, or see a path through. So really removing those institutional barriers, whether it's library fines that don't allow you to get access to your transcripts or to graduate, parking fines, things of that nature when, when students are re-enrolling for the next semester, et cetera. It's really incumbent on the institutions to remove those barriers. Students are always going to be facing some personal barriers, but institutions, there's a lot in their control that they can do to streamline and improve the pathway into and through their institution.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that institutions, or I guess like kind of going off the point that institutions haven't done enough. Why haven't they? And what more could they do? And how could policymakers then support them in that effort?
Well, just one thought, we've been talking a lot about, the data and the data that's available. And, maybe one day we could get to a perfect place where, White House College Scorecard is 100% complete and it's got all the variables that we would ever want. I know that through my personal experience going to college, and I came from a relatively, resourced family. I didn't look and shop around. And odds are, yes, the tools have gotten better, but there were tools at the time. And I think that the idea that we're going to expect passively for students to be able to access this information is not the right way to go. And so I think that what we encourage at Complete College America on this front is making sure that there's a lot more activity, and it kind of depends on the student profile and where in the student life cycle it's happening. So for example, if I'm a dually enrolled student taking high school credit while in high school, but also getting college credit through the same course, is it mandatory somewhere that I'm getting this sort of information about different programs at local colleges, at local return rate, and what are the returns on those different majors? I think that once I'm in college, let's not forget, 30% of students are community college students. They're ultimately going to transfer to a place that's way more expensive. And then there's a few years, hopefully only 2, but, lots of students attend part-time. So in that case, hopefully only 3 or 4, but, there's first year experience courses, advising that you can start embedding this information. And Lord knows there's a whole marketplace of tools that have taken college scorecard data and presented it in a way that can be very useful for students. The question is, 2 things for institutions. 1, are they embedding this information at different points in the student life cycle? And then 2, and this is where I think everybody falls down, is are they tracking adoption rates on those metrics and then seeing how those adoption rate metrics tie to the predictors of college completion that we've been talking about earlier? So then that way you can actually know that students are getting it as part of the technical system that you've devised in your college itself. And then policymakers, again, I would just go back to the data showing the problem, the types of practices that we're all talking about now, including the examples I just cited, and then saying, how do you codify that into policy?
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of going off of that point, how can, I guess, policymakers encourage or institutions and students to, I guess, use more and better data? Like, should there be mandatory disclosures in student loans or requirements for basic financial literacy training for college or for students pursuing post-secondary education, or some kind of different plan? And Rachel, I don't know if
Yeah, so we do a lot of work at NASA around kind of consumer information and student disclosures. And one thing that comes to mind, I think the financial literacy conversation is a very important one. I think it spans, it's across higher ed and even into high school education. I think that's something that, there's a lot of different inputs into that, that conversation. When thinking about disclosures related to student loans and more in the post-secondary context, something that we talk about quite a bit is the importance of strong consumer testing to ensure that the information we're providing to students is giving them, students, parents, families, what they need. I think historically in higher ed, there has been a tendency to just throw information at students. The more, the better. kind of the kitchen sink approach of let's just give students everything they could possibly need in every disclosure we send, and then they'll have it. And I think what often happens is students just sort of go into information overload. And when you have pages and pages and pages of information, or you have hours long, modules and trainings that you have to complete, sometimes I think the really important points, it's all important, but the most important points sometimes kind of get lost because there's just so much. And so one of the things that we talk about a lot with any consumer information, whether it's, loan counseling, just general financial literacy, aid offers, providing students with information on their costs and financial aid, is the importance of doing robust consumer testing to get a sense of A, what information do students, parents, and families need and want, and B, what is the best way to convey that information. It doesn't mean that, just because something isn't included on the initial financial aid offer doesn't mean it's not important, but is that the best method of getting that information to students? Is that really how it's going to resonate? Another thing I would mention is that right now, financial aid offices, institutions do not have the authority to mandate additional loan counseling outside of what is required by law. And so there are a lot of schools, I hear about this all the time from our members, financial aid administrators who say, our students would really benefit from this additional type of counseling, or we would really love to require that all of our incoming students, even those who aren't borrowing loans, are required to attend this loan counseling or this kind of informational educational session. But they are allowed to offer that additional counseling, but they are not allowed to require it. And so one of the things that we've advocated for is for Congress to provide aid administrators with the authority to mandate that additional counseling if they feel like it's in the best interest of their students. Every institution is different, every student is different, and we want financial aid offices to some degree to have the ability to customize whatever that additional counseling might be to really fit the needs of their specific students and their student population. But right now, it's just something that can be offered. It can't be required. And so that's, I think, another area where there's a lot of room for growth and an opportunity for Congress to kind of give institutions a little bit more, to put a little bit more muscle behind the efforts that they're already doing. I mean, I hear all the time from our members who offer these really neat and creative outreach campaigns, and even like multiple day courses on like how do you prepare to enter repayment, what does your debt mean now, what is it going to mean when you graduate, what is it going to mean 10 years down the line. But it can be really frustrating because they develop these curriculums and all these great resources, but then they don't have the authority to make sure that it gets in front of students. And oftentimes the students who might benefit most from those types of additional, education and training and resources are those that are either not aware that they exist, or for other reasons, because of other kind of personal commitments or responsibilities, they're not able to attend. And so that's something that we would really love to see. And I hear about frequently from our members who care a lot about making sure that their students know what their debt means and are borrowing responsibly and are going to be prepared to enter repayment, but just don't really have the ability to ensure that additional counseling is happening.
Yeah, I would just underscore that point with, advising capacity in high school is extremely underfunded. And, there are certainly advances that are needed in the type of information and the presentation of information needed for, to help students. But students also need, and their families need, support to be able to use that information to make a decision. And that advising support is often just not there because of high student counselor ratios in high school. And for adult students who do make up a significant portion of undergraduates, there's even fewer supports for them to really be able to understand which programs will be beneficial to them and their families. So really investing in that counseling component as well as better data is really critical.
Absolutely. So to kind of play, I guess, a bit of a devil's advocate on that front, why should students, I guess, need that counseling? Is when it comes to post-secondary education, a lot of the time outcomes can be a bit, I don't want to say obvious, but students can be a bit more aware of outcomes. For example, if they attend a private university versus public university, the costs that each will incur. If they pursue a very lucrative career versus one that is perhaps underfunded, shouldn't at some point common sense kind of guide post-secondary decisions?
Well,
So,
go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, and my own experience as a first generation college student, first in my family to go, Pell Grant recipient, that information may be obvious now to my children because I, have gone to college and continued on through graduate school to get a PhD. I'm going to be able to help my children in a way that and provide support that was not available to me because my parents didn't have and my family and community didn't have the experience and exposure to help me understand what kind of information I was getting. So, as a personal story from a data person, so I'm using anecdote here, but it's indicative of a larger problem. Uh, I got all of these brochures from colleges after taking the ACT and the SAT. I scored well on them, and I put them in a crate and I put them under my bed because I didn't know how to make sense of them. I didn't know what they meant. I went to my high school counselor. He said, there's a box of paper applications to public Ohio universities over there in the corner, have at it. So, I honestly didn't understand the difference between different types of public institutions. I didn't understand really the difference between public and private institutions. When you are a first generation student, you do not have the language to even know what questions to ask. And you don't have that kind of community knowledge to help bolster your decisions along the way. So I think that there are a lot of students who are trying to make these decisions out there on their own, and those are the students that I'm worried about.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I mean, I think that's super well said, and that that sort of gap. I mean, it's even if you have a lot of resources is hard, and then if you don't have a lot of resources, I think that with what time are you going to be doing this? And this is all assuming, again, like we keep coming back to this point of like, this is all assuming perfect information, right? But the existing data, as we've discussed, is already not comprehensive. We did not discuss the fact that it lives in like 80 different places. I mean, we've been emphasizing White House College Scorecard, but there's the U.S. Census Post-Secondary Outcomes Explorer, which gives you the return on investment. I mean, these are both from the feds, right? There's, iPads. There's all these different sources that you have to triangulate to be able to get there. And then, on the return side, it's pretty weak because, we haven't mandated, greater transparency. And then finally, and I would say most importantly, again, don't want to lose the point that if you line up 10 random colleges, 9 in 10 are either understating or not reporting at all what their net price is. So this is all, after you get to the point that Jennifer made of like, okay, I want to know, and I've somehow miraculously built this vocabulary on my free time.
Absolutely, and those are very well put points. We do have an audience comment that there are nonprofits that try to provide this information for free, but it is challenging to get the funding to disseminate the information. So these nonprofits are providing this information, doing very good work, but they could use that more funding. They could use more support in that. So I guess how can and what can policymakers do in this situation to, I guess, improve access to the data to help students along with their planning their post-secondary education and making sure they have enough guidance and information to make the best decision?
Early in my career, I worked for the Council for Opportunity in Education, which is an organization that supports federal TRIO programs and their staff and students. And I believe at the time, and I think it's probably still the case, that federal TRIO programs can only serve about 10% of the eligible low-income first-generation population. And so there really is a dearth of funding and support for these programs, even despite evidence that they can be supportive. I think some of this needs to become part of how K-12 institutions are funded, because standalone programs that don't have kind of ongoing appropriations, I think can be subject to, again, foundations and federal funding and other sources that may be challenging to maintain over time. But partnering them with K-12 institutions and providing resources to K-12 institutions to be able to offer these services, I think is really critical. But I do think there's a huge gap in the field right now.
Absolutely. We have another audience question too. Could lack of transparency of aid info be false advertising? For example, freshman aid budgets are larger to entice commits, but decrease each year, which is not disclosed. Charles, I feel like that touches on a point that you made earlier about these institutions that don't report certain data, and that leaves their students in the dark about their outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I do want to add one thing on the prior point about, sorry, I'm just looking at the question again, on the provision of information across the field. I do think also that there's many different roles different organizations should be playing. So I think that there's a lot of research out there that doesn't get amplified. I mean, that's like the understatement of the year, right? And I think that there's organizations, such as my organization, such as the Institute for Higher Education Policy, that do a very good job of getting that out there and getting that into institutions' hands. But I think that, I'll just speak for CCA. I like very much where I work, and it's something that we need to work on too. Like, how do we get more of the research? We certainly try to bring it into institutions' hands. But there's a lot of research organizations that put out so many fantastic things that just need amplification. And then regarding the point about having transparent finance, I mean, completely. I think that there are many institutions, many in the for-profit space, that can be downright predatory in terms of the false advertising around aid packages. I think that intentional or not, sometimes it could be very unintentional. Lots of sticker prices are advertised in weird ways where, maybe the tuition per credit hour will be minuscule, but then the fees will be, multiples the tuition per credit hour. And I do think that, we really do need some sort of mechanism for enforcing that. And we used to have, a really strong gainful employment process, which is also something that we haven't really touched on. It was very onerous to institutions, but it helped with a lot of this. And so I think we need to be working our data muscles in tandem with our enforcement muscles. And I'm speaking of enforcement to institutions, not students.
One other thing I would add there, I agree with Charles's comments, and I would also add on the point, the specific question around kind of the transparency of aid amounts from year to year. One of the things NASFA over the last few years has included we have like a code of conduct for our members. So things that all members, financial aid offices across the country have to do to sort of remain in good standing as a NASFA member, includes things that have to be included on aid offers. And one of the things on that list is renewal requirements for each type of aid being offered. And so if there's, a student might receive even a merit-based scholarship that it may not even come from the institution itself. It might be funded by a donor who says, I want all students receiving this scholarship to have a GPA of 3.0. And so if that's a requirement that the student's going to have to meet in order to maintain that scholarship from their first year to their second year, that needs to be communicated very clearly to students. So that's one of the things that I think a lot of institutions are already practicing. To Charles's point, it's not universal, but it's something that we've put a big focus on. Additionally, there's a practice that is often referred to as scholarship displacement, which is a little bit different, but it's where students maybe might receive their financial aid package from their institution that includes need-based aid, and then receive an outside scholarship. Maybe it's from a high school athletic booster or a community-based organization for $500. and then would see their institutional aid package reduced to reflect that they've received additional outside resources that then would impact, the amount of their financial need and kind of what the institution is meeting with institutional dollars. NASA supported a bill that was introduced by Congressman Kim last Congress that would, at the very least, require that institutions disclose what those practices are, so that students know how kind of those outside scholarship dollars might impact the institutional dollars that were included on an aid offer.
Yeah, I would just add, relative to, there's just a lot of need to streamline a lot of this information. There are two different net prices available in iPads. Both of them are based on students who get aid, which on the one hand, makes sense because you've got your sticker price and then you want to know what's the net price for students who get aid. But it's not readily available to know, well, what percentage of students are getting aid. So then you don't know if you're going to fall in the sticker price camp or the net price camp. Again, needing to be able to personalize that information, and a lot of the information focuses on first year students. And again, part of that is burden reduction considerations for institutions, but that's why iPads is not ideal for being able to collect this information, because we could very readily collect information on, over the course of students' enrollment, disaggregating it by a number of, characteristics. But it is burdensome for institutions to have to tack on yet another survey to an already complicated survey that is iPads, as opposed to add another column in an Excel spreadsheet. And so that's the trade-off that we're making here, that we're asking for imperfect information on purpose because we think it's going to reduce burden, but ultimately it's not helping the institution or the student. And we need to address that.
Absolutely. Charles, do you have any, ideas on how we can begin to address that, or how policymakers can help?
Well, I mean, specifically around that last point that I was giving the double thumbs up to, I think that's tricky, and I'm curious, also, Jennifer, and Rachel, what the positive view on it is. I mean, I'll start with my take. I think that in the dream world, we would get something like the College Transparency Act passed that would allow for being able to provide data in a much more flexible, God forbid, 21st century manner. And I think that in lieu it'll be interesting to see what happens in the House to see if that goes forward. I know that per the government accountability report that I kept citing with the 91% invalidity on the net price, that was something that the head of the House committee found appalling. So maybe that's something that can be considered as, even on the House side, that the act could get revived. And then I would just say, in lieu of that, there is something that can be done immediately, which is that colleges can join the post-secondary data partnership. I know I sound like a shill for National Student Clearinghouse when I say that, but I mean, it is the best hope from a market-driven perspective, because they collect information from every college. The data is already there, and I think the foundation has been incredible at pushing that usage. Obviously, I'm a true believer and completely share that vision. I think that there's sometimes that the market can solve it, and this very well could be one of them if we get to an inflection point on adoption.
Absolutely. And speaking, of the College Transparency Act, if you could, implement that ideal system, and what types of data would it contain, and how would it all be organized together?
I'll start really quick, just because sorry, I'm being selfish. But I think this really leads into another project I know that, I believe it's in Jennifer's shop, but you got to know what you want to measure first, right? How are you trying to depict reality? And then once you know that, then you're going to know what data holes you presently have and how you're going to need to fill it. And then on the institutional side, you got to work down to that bottom layer. What are the daily and the weekly metrics that are going up to the types that we've been talking about with the predictors, or additional that may be found out once you've got the full comprehensive framework of all the things that you want to measure fleshed out. And then I think from there, if there's the right conversations at the right time, what I kind of like to jargonly call performance dialogues, then you have the ability for this to take root the way it does at the most efficient companies.
Yeah, I would second that, The post-secondary data partnership that Charles referenced is based on the post-secondary metrics framework that the Institute for Higher Education Policy put out probably in 2016, I think is when that originally came out. And what they did to construct that, and it's really focused on what are the metrics that matter that help us, improve student outcomes with respect to completion. They looked at 24 college completion initiatives, including Complete College America, and said, where is there some convergence around what the field is saying we need and that we can't get from existing data systems? And so would really encourage folks to look at the post-secondary metrics framework that I have put out, because that is the basis of the post-secondary data partnership. It's based on collecting those metrics, and those are really field-tested metrics by these completion initiatives. Similarly, the Post-Secondary Value Commission, also led by IHEP, starts to introduce some, there's been kind of a pretty big increase in the amount of earnings data available in the last 5 years. So there's been different ways of looking at how to measure earnings in relation to different benchmarks. And so the Post-Secondary Value Commission has an economic thresholds framework that looks at first, did students at least get that minimum return? Are they making more than a high school grad and enough to pay back what they invested in their college education? Then are they making enough, making what they expect to earn in their field? Are they making enough to experience economic mobility? Are they making the same as, other people in their field, meaning are women, people of color earning the same as, their counterparts? And so, unfortunately, the answer to a lot of those questions is no. And so it just underscores the need to look not just at completion, but also the post-college outcomes to have a complete picture of how students are faring in post-secondary today.
I would echo everything that's been shared related to the great work IHEP has done. Such a wonderful job of kind of digging into the metrics, and I think laying the groundwork for what the work that's going to need to be done if and when the College Transparency Act passes. And I think, just to put a really fine point on it, to your initial question, Morgan, like what can policymakers do? I think first and foremost is pass the College Transparency Act, for all the reasons that have been shared by Jennifer and Charles. From an institutional perspective, one thing I did want to add, we're part of the Post-Sec Data Collaborative. We're supporters of the College Transparency Act, which I think, there are some, usually when we join these conversations, our role is kind of talking about like, what does it mean for institutions, institutional burden, and something that I think some folks are surprised to hear is that the College Transparency Act would actually very likely decrease burden on institutions, which kind of goes all the way back to the beginning. Jennifer mentioned that a lot of the current reporting is compliance driven, and financial aid offices, I feel like our community is just full of like really hard workers and worker bees. And part of the reason for that is that there's so much regulation that falls on the financial aid office, and reporting is one of those things, very compliance driven. But the great thing about the College Transparency Act is that it would, rather than institutions having to do all of the calculations themselves like they're currently doing when reporting data through iPads, the type of student level data system that would be created through the College Transparency Act very likely could allow institutions to share data sets directly with the federal government rather than having to crunch those numbers themselves, which would then in turn reduce burden. Of course, there's going to be kind of a transition that would need to happen from an old to a new system, but long term, not having to do those calculations, reporting that data directly to Ed would reduce burden on institutions, which I think would also really go a long way in helping kind of reduce that more compliance-driven culture of data reporting that financial aid offices have sort of been forced to get used to over the last several decades. So in addition to what CTA would do for students, creating a user-friendly portal of sorts that they could use to have clear and transparent information, I think it would also really help institutions by decreasing reporting burden and freeing up time and resources to do the other really important work of sitting down and counseling students and sort of supporting them through those important decisions.
Absolutely. And I guess the more that we can streamline all this and make it easier for everyone to report, the more data that students will have, which is incredibly important. We are reaching the end of our panel discussion today. So thank you all so much for joining. This was a wonderful conversation, and hopefully policymakers can figure out how to help students reduce their student debt soon.